Hello and welcome to my recap of round 5 of the 2024 candidates. I've been chomping at the bit to share with you my recap of this round because this round had every single game brought something to it. And we're going to start with the gameplay between FIDE against Fabiano Caruana. Although the game ended in a draw, we'll see that White actually got some interesting opportunities where this time FIDE, rather than playing the move knight c3, that Ferrugia had played against Caruana earlier in the tournament. This time we saw the more positional approach of take, and d3. And now rather than trying to transpose back into the g6 territory with g6, Black instead played the move bishop g4, which is the more independent approach to the position, where Black is looking to go for a sub like knight d7, try to put a pawn on e5, and get a very reliable structure in the center in this way. This somewhat explains why FIDE played the move of bishop to f4, trying to avoid the e5 push. Also, it would be possible to play it some other ways. For example, moves such as b3 and going for this up is one possible approach. But it would be another topic altogether. Also, if you are enjoying this video recap by me, and you're enjoying the series in general, do make sure to leave a like and also to consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like these in your feed in the future. That being said, let's see how the game transpired, where at this point, if Black does play knight d7, we can see that after g4 and knight bd2 that it becomes very difficult for Black to actually get an e5. Because if Black goes f5, f6, White will just beat Black to the punch with e5. And just have a very nice advantage with his much better pawn structure. So this is why Caruana plays c4, quite a precise move to use the vulnerability of the e4 pawn to undouble the pawns. We had knight c3, captures, e6, g4, bishop to g6, and position has some contours like a Slav defense, except with the pawn being on d3 instead of d4. Which does mean the bishop on g6 is going to be a little bit passive here. And, well, with queen to b3, White showed he was ready to try to exert some pressure. Queen to b6 defends the pawn, bishop e3. And note that exchanging the queens with queen b3 does not solve all of Black's problems here. As in this case, White can play knight e5 and, has ideas of trying to go after the g6 bishop, as it were. Also, it's even possible to maneuver the knight to c4 and to exploit those weaknesses on the dark squares for Black. So this is why Caruana ultimately played the move queen to c7 here, keeping a bit more tension in the position. And probably was doing this hoping to maximize his winning chances by creating an imbalance at any price. But yeah, in this case, probably it's more precise to play bishop d6 and only then play the move knight to d7. So that if White does play knight h4 is in the game, you have the option of bishop f4 to use the weakness in White's structure to kind of balance the chances a bit. Because after knight d7, the difference now is that after bishop d6 is how it played in the game. Or now I can even just play a move like d4 and bishop f4 just doesn't really have the same effect when White can push ahead with e5 and get a structure like this where the square of d6 is going to be a big sore point for Black in the long term. In the game, king b1 as FIDE played is also perfectly fine, of course. And I think Caruana already sensed his position was quite difficult because castling short is kind of out of the question when, you can just play like d4 takes and just have a very ready-made attack on the h-file with h4, h5. This is, not really going to be a thing for Black. And if you castle long, this is a little bit more solid, but still runs into some problems where like knight b5 is now a threat. And Black is going to have to weaken his king a little bit earlier than he would like, let's say. So that's also not a panacea, and this maybe explains why already Caruana was looking for some way to kind of create some swindling chances, and that's where the move a5 and trying to open the a-file came into play, where after takes, and d4 we see Black playing this move of a4 here, sacrificing a pawn, but at least opening up the a-file for possible counterplay against the White king. Now, it should be said that White is considerably better here, and in the game, FIDE played a really great move of knight to c5, just keeping the position stable, avoiding any counterplay with b4 and stuff like this. And with knight c5, yeah, just making sure that we keep that more symmetrical structure where black's going to have a lot less counterplay. If black does play a move like bishop e5, well, that can open the door for things like h4 and being able to go for an attack on the king side with h5 for when black castles. To avoid this, Caruana played the move bishop e7, but Vidit played the move of h4 anyway, realizing that black can't really take the pawn on h4 because after takes, and now the move g5, the trap snaps shut for the bishop, and that is going to be technically winning for white. Queen e5 does save the bishop, but the threats like queen e7 and the weak black king are just going to be a bit too much in a position like this, for example, where we'll pick up this pawn and just have these free connected passes to win the game for white. So in the game, black goes rook a4 instead. White defends his pawn with bishop to d4. And now black played the move e5. Position is already pretty difficult for black, but even castling is not going to solve the problems by any means, like the attack does kind of play itself, and white is ultimately a pawn up at the end of the day. But instead, black goes e5, which does force white to be a little bit precise here. And to Vidit's credit, he found this very strong move of queen to g3, exploiting the pin and realizing that f6 is not really a successful defense for black because of the move g5. When we threaten to take on f6 and discover an attack on the g6 bishop, of course they can't take our bishop because of the pin here. And yeah, if king f7, you can even just keep on attacking, and there's not much black can really do to survive. So realizing his position is lost, Caruana went for the last-ditch swindling attempt. Queen a7, queen e5, rook a2, queen g7, and rook a1 doesn't really lead anywhere. The white king is just going to start just running to safety, basically. So black goes rook f8, and this is where we really have the key moment of the game, where if white is able to sort of deal with this attack down the a file and keep his king safe, well then white's going to be up 2 pawns and basically just win the game, because the black king will also be quite exposed in the long term once we do consolidate. And the move that white really should have played here is, well, there's technically more than one winning line, but what white should have done is he should have started running with the king with a move like king to c2. King c1 with similar ideas would also work. And I think what Vidit might have been concerned about was the counterplay with queen a4 and the king coming under some fire. But it turns out that black does run out of checks here, like queen b4, king e3 does keep that king safe, and black can't really continue to checks in a good way. Or, if bishop c5, we also have like queen e5, and you can sort of see that black is just getting killed in this instance once we line things up on the d file. So that would have given Vidit a win, and would have seen come right back in the tournament. And definitely would have been a major blow to Caruana's ambitions for tournament victory as well. But instead, white blundered with the move queen e5, just completely missing white's response of queen a4, threatening the checkmate on rook a1. And white can't just defend it with king c1, because then black will play the move of f6. And your queen b8, king f7 is nothing now, but if you do move the queen to another square, black now has rook a1. They'll take the bishop, and suddenly it's black who is winning in this case. So as a result of this blunder, it meant that basically white had to force a draw here with queen b8, bishop d8. Again, there's no time for bishop f6 because black's threatening mate. And yeah, we just had a free-fold repetition by position like so. A bit of a disappointment for Vidit, and I think from this game we can sort of, I guess, conclude, that, well, Vidit has certainly been getting chances in these games, but yeah, when you miss a chance like this, it's going to be hard to finish in sort of a high position, and, for Caruana, to kind of be losing in such a convincing way, yeah, it doesn't necessarily bode well for his chances to win the tournament, even if he is still only half a point off the lead after this round. But anyway, let's go on to the next game, and this one, it was also a draw, but it was also a game where white actually had some really good opportunities as such. And Nepomniachtchi, I think, definitely will consider himself quite lucky to have survived not just the a very difficult position against Gukesh, but also this tough position against Pragnananda. And this line here with Bishop D6 is of course a very mainline system. Nepo is also playing it in the World Championship match against Carlsen, and just basically recycling that preparation here. So it's all pretty standard, like very standard structure in the Petrov. White has more space, but black has one less pawn island in compensation. But we'll see here that Prague was very, very well prepared for this game. Playing the move knight h4, which is the critical continuation, trying to disrupt black's coordination by grabbing the bishop pair. After bishop e6, we have takes, queen g5. This is not winning a piece, because white does have the move knight f3 to counterattack the queen. Queen a5, and here a normal move in this position would be to play something like bishop b3. The point being that queen takes c3 would then be a little bit too risky. Like white just gets way too strong of an attack on the light squares in response, and h6 knight e4 would pick up the bishop essentially by kicking the queen out of the way. But Prague came up with a different idea of playing the move bishop to h3, which, checking in the database, actually is has not been played according to Lichess Masters database. And well, we're stopping black playing knight d7. This is one of the points of white's play. And after queen c3 is played in the game, white is getting some very nice attack here, where all of his pieces are coming into the game, and Prague continued to play quite fast with d5, just sacking a second pawn, but really opening up the floodgates to the black position. Of course, queen d5 would be a blunder, because rook d3 would skewer the queen and the bishop. So that is why black was basically compelled to take with the pawn. And now Prague showed his idea with the move of knight to g5, threatening ideas of even sacrificing to bring the pieces into the attack. And at this point, Nepo's move of h6 is probably not technically a mistake, but I do agree with Leital's verdict that this is probably not the most practical solution, that a move such as g6 and sort of dealing with queen h5 is probably a better approach here. Or a move like bishop e7 and kind of forcing white's hand into sacking in this way might also have been a consideration. But I do think I like g6 best, because it does just neutralize those sacks on f7 and a7 to really play on the light squares. But you might be wondering, well, why is this sack even working in the first place? Like, isn't white just blundering a piece here? But white's point is that the move rook d3 is now a thing. And with the move rook d5, white is threatening a fork on the queen and the bishop. And it's not the easiest thing for black to defend effectively, because let's say you play a move like bishop e7, for example, to keep the bishop safe. Well, then there's moves like queen e2 available, and suddenly queen e6 is a really big mate threat that's very, very hard for black to get out of. You can't really keep your king in the center, because you're just going to get murdered on the light squares here. In this position, I think the best move according to the computer is to play the move g6, which, definitely a very computerish move, of course, but the idea is that you're just avoiding some problems like queen h5 in some positions, and white definitely still has a strong enough attack for the material with the knight and the rook out of play, but it would ultimately be only sufficient for a draw at the end. Black would run the king out of the way, and white can play some precise moves and still have enough of an attack. But it's not going to be more than that. If you are curious about the line, it could go something like this, like takes, and basically black's up a bit of material, but white's going to have enough activity with his pieces that it's just going to be equal at the end of the day. But anyhow, that's a bit of a different story. And in the game, black played a move knight to d7. It might seem a bit weird why I didn't just play knight a6 and do it this way, but he played knight d7. White played the move rook d5, deciding not to take the knight, but to go after the bishop instead. And this is where Nepo made a mistake that technically should have cost him the game. What he needed to play was the move of bishop takes h2, and only then the move of knight to c5. And in this way, black would sort of buy himself the time needed to run the king to safety with king to g8. For example, rook e1, king g8, and if white does play some active move like rook e7, just prioritizing the initiative. Queen g4 and queen d4 are big threats, but it turns out that black will be able to bring the queen to the safety of the king, and that will, after some more complications, allow black to survive here. But in the game, black instead played knight c5, and now after rook d6, black is facing a very big check of queen d5 to embarrass the king. And if you get very greedy and take with queen a2 here, the problem is that white has this very strong quiet move of g3, which the idea of bishop g2 is not just to threaten the rook, but you're also threatening bishop d5 check. So if the rook moves away, you're still dealing with the bishop d5 check threat, which is just going to leave the king stuck in the center. Black's not going to have time to run the king away to safety, and that will give white a completely crushing attack. So this is why Nepo played the more safe move of king g8. And after queen e5, king h8, this is really where we get to, you could say, the most critical position of the game, where this is where Prague by far had his best chance to win. And after he missed his opportunity, the game did start to move a little bit more towards equality as such. So it turns out that the key move here in this position, I will admit I'm a little bit surprised that Prague didn't see it in the game, but perhaps in this announcement we can perhaps try to figure out what it is that he missed specifically. But to my mind, a move like queen e5 is just very, very natural, where you are simply threatening to play the move rook takes h6 and just continue the attack on the king. A move like king g8 is sort of an obvious attempt to deal with this. Of course, king h7, bishop f5, we don't really want to, help the bishop activate with tempo. But if king g8, it turns out white will just play rook g6, rook f7, and just simply play a tactic, take, and queen d5, which will pick up the rook on a8 with check, and white is up material and the black king is exposed. So it's an easy win for white in a position like this. So my guess is that maybe Prague was not sure how exactly to convert after queen takes a2, thinking maybe a position like this is not so clear-cut, with black having the connected passed pawns and white really being dependent on making his attack work. No, it turns out this position is still much better for white, because we do have the bishop versus a knight, where the bishop can do a good job at dealing with those pawns in the long term. And more significantly, we do still have a very strong attack against the king. Like, we can play bishop to f5, involve the h-pawn in the attack, and it's going to be very tough for black to survive. Now, the computer points out after queen a2 that you can even improve on this with the move bishop to f5, and to, sort of give the rook h6 move a bit more sting as such, where after king g8, white can even play like bishop b1, and it turns out we can sort of be a little bit computerish and like bring the queen around, prepare the bishop to come in this way, and make it very difficult for black to survive. But okay, this line is, I think, beyond the reach of most humans in all fairness, but I do think that seeing that rook h6 is going to give white a nice edge is sort of findable in a sense. I guess it's almost like more a psychological decision of being willing to brave the counterplay rather than, trying to play it safe with bishop f5 first, which is what happened in the game, but then running into the move of knight to b7 as such. Also, I guess I should point out before moving on, white could also have played queen d1, and, to be fair, I guess it's worth pointing out that, this version with, like, rook h6 is probably actually a much easier one to calculate from a human point of view, because rook h5 here does prove a lot more effective with the queen on d4 than with the queen on e5, because now you can meet rook a8 with queen h4 and, line up the attack in this way to force black's king in the open, whereas you don't really have that option with the queen on e5, let's say. So that's sort of probably even an easier variation where, of course, they go king g8, it's just going to transpose back to the other line, as it were. So you could say, queen d4 is definitely a little bit more simple in that respect to figure out the finer points. Though, to be fair, it does allow king h7 without white having bishop f5. So it's still a little bit tricky, actually, in this case. So, not the easiest situation, but after bishop f5, probably Prague thought, well, if I just get the bishop to b1 and tee up a battery against h7, then white will just be completely winning. Which is true, but the problem is now knight b7 basically forces an endgame where, because queen b7, queen f5 is just nothing for white now. But after queen a5, knight a5, like maybe it was the case that perhaps Prague overestimated his chance in this endgame, thinking that he had more winning chances than he does. But also to Nepo's credit, he defended it very, very well, where the more obvious approach is probably to go knight b7 and just anchor the knight on the c5 outpost, which would be a good alternative to what happened in the game. But the way Nepo played with knight c4 and rook a8 is also perfectly fine. We can sort of see white's edge starting to dilute a bit here. Whereas the way the game played out, black just had this blockade on the dark squares, where white just not really able to make any progress, and it's not really able to leverage the supposed advantage of the bishop versus a knight, because the bishop just is kind of hitting thin air for the rest of the game. Ultimately, the game concluded rook d6, king g7, rook e1, rook f6. Black's quite happy just to trade down and just have a very drawish position. Take, rook d7, king to f8. So obviously black does not mind the pawns getting traded into just a pure rook endgame. And after a5, king g3, knight g6. The knight, when it gets to f4, is going to be quite a nuisance around the white king. So white decides just to accept that it's going to be a draw and trades into this dead drawn rook ending. And at this point, the players did, in fact, agree a draw as such. At some point, the pawns are also going to get hoovered off, basically. So the first two games, we see that there was some good opportunities for the Indian players. And, in a different universe, we could have even seen, like, all three Indians, like, winning all three of the games to, kind of make it very clear, that India is just the strongest chess country nowadays, in a sense. Well, I guess other than the US with, like, a lot of their players. But, so it is clearly the top two powerhouses by far in the chess world. But anyway, I digress a bit. Let's get into the next game, and this one, let's flip the board around. Actually, let's see it from Nakamura's point of view, because Nakamura did in fact win this game against Firouzja, which basically led to Firouzja ending up in last place after this game. So it featured Italian game, very standard, but the move h6 is a slightly unusual move order by Nakamura. The idea of this being that you're avoiding some options like bishop to g5, which is not one of the absolute main lines, but it's approach some players like Demchenko really like to go for with the white pieces. So h6 is kind of just a move order point, trying to transpose back into d6 territory, but reduce our workload a little bit in the process. And as you might expect, the top players are going to be looking for every little edge they can get, and Firouzja with the move b4 was, trying to set some problems, making a point that bishop b6, a4, that, you can try to get a bit of extra space and, work a small edge like this here, let's say, with, something like this being pretty standard. But in the game, black played bishop to e7, so reverting back to, one of the closed bishop e7 systems. But it is true that bishop e7 systems are typically thought to be a little bit better for white, just because they are not as active as having the bishop on c5. But of course, Nakamura came prepared with some ideas of his own, and this move at knight b8 at first glance seems kind of ridiculous, but it actually kind of makes sense when you think about it a bit more deeply. That after castles, we can play the move of c6 and go for d5 to threaten the bishop with tempo. Or if they play a move like queen c2 to make some air for the bishop, d5 is still fine, but you could also play a move like a5 and, start to create some weaknesses in the white structure. Such in a position like this, which, slightly resembles what we'll see in the game. But something like this would basically just be fine for black. He's just going to defend the e5 pawn, bring the knight around, bring the bishop out, and black's just going to have no problems whatsoever here. So this perhaps explains why Firouzja decided to play a little bit more directly with the move d4, trying to make use of his space value to the center, so that it's in keeping with his very dynamic style of play. Take, a5, just try and create some weaknesses in the structure again. Like if b5 is played, for instance, then a really nice idea that surely Nakamura had planned was the move d5, where you sacrifice a pawn temporarily, but black is going to kind of be able to take that pawn back as he pleases and just have a pretty decent position against IQP in general. I ended up playing the move e5, trying to play again a little bit more directly, and knight fd7 and taking e5 is probably the most standard, but Nakamura decided to go knight to h5 and have some ideas of bringing the knight in this way, which to be fair is also possible. We had knight f4, probably castling's the most natural, of course not at king f1 but castling, but probably Ferrugia was not wanting to allow the bishop to get traded as such. But apparently it's still, going to be, still going to be very possible for white to play this way. Well, you'll go bishop a3, trade off the bishop pair, and make the point that white's extra space may give white a little something here. But the game instead saw g3, and black, found a very good intermediate move of d5, realizing that if white does take, that black is going to have excellent compensation for the pawn with his very good control over the light squares, and the white king being a bit weak in the long term. So white goes bishop f1, good practical decision there. Knight e6, bishop g2, c6, and this is all pretty standard. I think in this position, probably the one white piece that's a little bit passive is the bishop on c1. I suppose the bishop on g2 is also a little bit stuck behind the pawn chain, but that's a different problem. But I think again, bishop a3 is probably the way white should play if he wants to try to generate anything from this position. But after bishop b2, knight b6, I think that the black was just doing fine here. We had take, bishop c3, and now a nice move from Nakamura in c5 to free his pieces, as it were, where we're quite happy to play bishop c5 and activate our bishop and start pushing the pawn and such. So of course white doesn't release the tension unfavorably. He just keeps it with rook fb1, prompting a slightly awkward rook a6 in response. Of course, bishop f1 doesn't really work because we've got c4 to cover it. So white plays a move d takes c5, bishop c5. So that if white does play bishop f1, we can retreat the rook, knowing that the bishop is now taking the place of defending the knight. In the game, white played a good move, queen to b5, just eyeing that weakness on a5 here. And black played the move queen c7, also a good reply, realizing that bishop a5 is not really winning a pawn now, because queen a7 and either you're going to regain the pawn on a4, or if they do take, I suppose technically white does actually keep the pawn after queen f1, but it's so passive though, where you can take, and if white does play knight b1, they're just kind of sort of the cure is worse than the disease here. White's not going to be able to hang on to this extra pawn forever because the black piece is way too active. In the game, white realized this and he played a more logical rook c1, placing rook opposite the queen. Queen a7 gets out of the way, and if white plays a move like knight b3 here, he's probably still doing fine, but queen e2 was played, and this does give black a little bit of an opportunity to play a move like d4 and start to make use of his passed pawn, which, admittedly, this is not what happened in the game, but I think a player like Abdul Sattor, for example, would play d4 just instantly. It'd be very obvious to him that this would be the way to play it, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with the move bishop d7 by Nakamura either. It's also a good move to go after this pawn on a4 and hit that weakness. And we can kind of feel with the way this is playing out that, white is kind of the one who is fighting for equality here, because you can't take twice on c4 without running in a bishop f2, which is a pretty big problem, actually. So white decides to try and play around the knight and plays the move knight b3. We have bishop to b6, keeping the pressure. Rook d1, queen a8 defends the pawn. You could argue queen b7 is a little more precise, but it's not the world's biggest difference. It does mean that your rook can come back into play, though, which is kind of cool. But the game saw rook queen a8, bishop to g2, placing it opposite the queen in a sense. Knight c5 was played, and it's true, the players, they're not in severe time trouble, but starting to get just a little bit low on time, and that's very reflected in some of the decisions where I think with more time on the clock, black would probably just, make sure that all of his pieces are in the game and, just kind of keep it simple in a way. Because after knight c5 and takes and bishop c5, it turns out knight h4 is probably a little bit of a step in the wrong direction, putting knight on the edge of the board. Whereas on d4, the knight definitely has a lot more activity, where you're blockading the d5 pawn, you're neutralizing the pressure. And you also potentially clear the way to be able to defend your e5 pawn with f4. Like, for example, rook e8, we can even play like knight b3 and also set up this threat. So it turns out, we're not having to worry about the weakness of the e5 pawn in this case. It's actually pretty easy for white to cover. But the game saw knight h4. Black played the move knight b6 to defend his pawn. We had bishop d4, takes. Rook a7, just preparing to bring that rook back into play. h3 was played, rook c7, and yeah, this entry in g4 does feel a tiny bit optimistic, where it's too much to call it a mistake, but I do feel like, the attack, this isn't really the requirements for the attack to work in a sense, because the center is just a little bit too open here, and after rook c5, of course, white is never going to take on d5 and, just weaken his own king like this. It's not worth the pawn you're getting to play this way, but white instead plays queen f4, which at first glance might seem like a blunder that you're running into the g5 fork, but Firouzja's idea is that after queen f6 that black would be ill-advised to play takes on h4, because after queen takes h6, it's very hard to get out of, the attack. Like, white's going to sort of swing the queen around in the right way, then the rook will enter the attack, and it's very hard for black to survive that. So black instead plays rook to e8, just keeping the pressure on e5. Knight f5, take, and yeah, the engine still gives us equal, but it's still a pretty dynamic position, where after rook e1, knight d7, white played the move e6 here, trying to keep his pawn alive. Take, knight f6, and yeah, when I saw this game live, I kind of felt at this point that even though the position was quite unbalanced, that the draw is probably the most likely result here. But I think that Firouzja maybe was still trying to win, because if white wants to make a draw, he can play a move like rook ed1, and probably black has slightly the better side of the draw here, but I think it's also fairly clear that white's never really going to lose a position like this one, let's say, with the equal material on a rook ending. But white played a move rook d2 instead, trying to keep a little more tension in the position, and now I start to feel that it gets a lot easier for black to play, where the white bishop is a little inept, the e6 pawn is overextended, and yeah, white's structure in general is just weaker, having 4 different pawn islands. Well, I suppose it's 3 if the pawns unite, but it's not so easy to do that here as white. So at rook b2, I like rook ec8 by black, just preparing to neutralize any checks. Bishop f1 was played. Again, maybe bishop f3 and a waiting approach might have been a little bit more to the point here, but in the game we had bishop f1, which does give the e4 square to the black knight. This is what happened in the game. And after bishop to d3, black could have considered a move like rook to c1 here and, tried to trade off the rook. So that, in a position like after, say, rook b7, well, for one thing, you can play to move king e6 and sort of take a pawn in a sense. So, yeah, so rook c set 1, I think, does set a few more problems. In the game, Nakamura kept a bit more tension in the position with knight to c3. White played f4, we had d4, and yeah, position gets very, very dynamic here, of course, where white has the connected passed pawns, but black can take a pawn. Well, technically can't take the pawn yet because f6 is a threat. Just to put it on the board, something like this is, yeah, not really something that you want to allow as black. Like the passed e-pawn is just way too strong here. If king e8, bishop g6 is going to be GG. But, however, you can sort of still see the contours of the position. Like black, with the move knight d5, is keeping the pawns blockaded. White plays move rook e4, continuing to apply some pressure. And black plays move knight b4, just wanting to just liquidate everything with f6 takes. And one difference we see here is that black can now play the move of rook f5, which wasn't the thing in the earlier variation with knight takes a4. After takes, white plays the move of e7, ignoring the threat to the bishop by making a stronger one of his own. Note, by the way, that rook e8 would not be a defense here because white does have bishop b5, take, and knight d5 is not in time because white will move the bishop and then queen the pawn after that. So black goes knight takes d3, and we get this very unbalanced position after take, knight to f4, king f1, d3, where Black has 2 pawns for the exchange, but he can also potentially pick up a third one and have 3 passed pawns. And this can get very, very sharp very quickly. For example, a move like Rook A8 might seem quite natural to grab this pawn, but it actually would be a blunder here because they can't actually take it because D2 will just queen, and if King E1, then Black can now start taking, and now the G pawn becomes very hard for White to stop. Like if you try to put your Rook behind the pawn, the problem is that Black is just going to play Knight G5, and the White King is not able to stop both of these pawns at once as such. So that explains why Firouzja played the move King F2, letting go of the pawn with check, but allowing the king to cover this pawn. Also hoping that, say, if Knight F4, that White can go Rook A8, start to, get his A pawn moving, and use that to give him, sufficient counterplay to save himself, as it were. We're not going to go deep in the analysis, but it turns out that, White will be able to hold in this instance. But in the game, Black played a move G4, which is, seemingly a little bit trickier based on how White played it, because at this point, all White really needs to do is basically just keep this kind of fortress that he has. So, for example, a move like Rook D8 and going after this pawn is rather to the point here. And then if G3, White can then play the move of King F3, making sure to catch this pawn while this Rook is behind the passed pawn. And in a position like this with King G3, Knight G5, King G3, and King E4, King F2, this one would just be a draw where Black will have enough counterplay to survive, but White will also be able to kind of pick off some pawns and basically liquidate to a draw in this way. Unfortunately for Firouzja, in the time pressure, he made a big blunder with King takes D3, and now after G3, Rook F8, and King E6. He resigned here because Rook F1 runs into G2, and you may have also seen that Rook J8 is also not a defense because Black can just play the move G2 here, and Rook takes G2, Knight F4 is going to just win the Rook and win the game. Clearly this is what Firouzja missed, and probably was only counting on the Knight G5 move that would sort of allow White to save himself. But yeah, very nice game by Nakamura. He definitely played with a very high level of accuracy in this game, and was a little back and forth in some small ways before this final blunder sort of sealed things. Now, as you probably noticed, this recap's going to be a bit longer than average just because every game had a lot of very interesting aspects to it. And that's especially true of this game between Gukesh against Abbasov, which had a very back and forth queen endgame that we are going to get to. It's definitely games like this kind of show why it's good to have a rest day, because with a rest day, it allows you to kind of get your energy and be able to play a really long game and a really long fight as such. And here Gukesh played the move of D4, which is kind of a sort of anti-Damiano Petrov, where it wouldn't surprise me if all of Abbasov had prepared this variation as a way to basically force a draw with the black pieces. I used to think this line was much better for White, but this is a variation I'll probably dive into in the video. Like once it's after the second rest day, on that day I'll probably do a video on the Damiano Petrov for the YouTube channel. Of course, if you have some requests, you can always put them in the comments below. But in the game, White played D4 with the idea that if takes E5 is going to give White quite a nice initiative. So Black plays Knight takes E4, Bishop D3, D5. And now the main line here is to play the move Knight takes E5 and try to use your extra tempo. But it's now fairly well known that Bishop D6 is a pretty reliable equalizer, thanks in part to the analyses of Nicolas Soterlis have sort of made this common knowledge, where people realize now that you can either take and play Knight C6 and basically be more or less fine in the arising complications here, or if you have a really good memory, you can play C5 and get this very very forcing play, but where Black is going to be fine after the mass liquidations in the center. Again, it's something that I may touch on in a later YouTube video, but that's sort of the starting point for your own investigations, let's say. But Gukesh plays the move D takes E5 instead, which is not really a trendy move at all, due to the move Knight C5 hitting the bishop. But that being said, it does lead to this unbalanced structure where White does have decent scope to play for a win. In fact, when I was a professional player, I actually would often aim for a similar position. but via this move order with playing knight d2 instead of bishop d3, so that when they play knight c5, they're not hitting the bishop with tempo. Like, say if you go bishop e2, you're kind of a tempo up on the game is kind of the idea. It's also true black's not forced to play knight c5, like they have other moves available too, but again, it's going perhaps a little bit off topic. But yeah, in the game we had bishop e2, bishop e7, and Abasov actually had a completely fine position out of the opening. Like, black has absolutely no problems here. The e5 pawn can even tend to be a little bit overextended if we're not careful. With a5, black is just sort of anticipating the knight coming into b3, grabbing a bit of space on this side of the board. In addition, you can also sometimes go c4 and try to open things up this way. It doesn't give an advantage, but it's a way to try to open things up a little more. But in the game, white played the move knight to b3. Black now played this move f6, bit of a dynamic approach. If you want just to solely equalize, I think an approach like a4 and say takes, and bishop f5 would be very comfortable for black. But of course, there's nothing terribly wrong with f6 and just trading off their central space either. The game saw ef6, knight f6, bishop e3, again, sort of the logic being that, well, if you take on c5, that it helps their bishop get to a more active square. Though it's kind of interesting to note that actually the computer disagrees a little with this Soviet notion, and that this approach might actually give white the best chances of an edge. The idea being we also can play bishop e3 to trade off their bishop and kind of get the tempo back in a sense. But the game saw the immediate bishop e3, which does allow black to bring the knight to e4, which also leaves the white knights looking a little bit awkward. Like, the fact that Gukesh played knight d2 already kind of tells you that he was sort of recognized his strategy not really being a success here in terms of fighting for an advantage. Takes, white now played the move a3 to stop black getting the pawn himself on a3 and creating some weaknesses in the white queenside structure. So a3 just stops that. Again, if black just wanted to stymie all of white's attempts to make progress, then a move like b5 and just stopping c4 altogether definitely deserves some attention. The move in the game, bishop c5, I think is maybe trying a little bit too hard to release the tension. It's one thing just to trade off the piece and try to make a solid draw, but what we see Gukesh doing is just letting black make those exchanges and allowing the pieces to come to more active squares with the recapture. Now, for the moment, black's position is still fine. He has no major weaknesses and his position is quite solid. But after bishop f5, it was paramount for black to play the move queen f5, put the rook on e8, and basically maintain the balance in this way, where the fact that white's structure being inflexible will mean that it is basically equal here. I'm not exactly sure why Abasov rejected this approach, but he played the move knight takes f5, which allowed white to play rook e6, and now the big difference is white does have a very strong grip over the e-file, which gives him a considerable advantage here. Also, moves like knight g5 and queen h5 can bring more pieces into the attack, so black played h6 to cover that, and I really, really like the move that Gukesh played here next. Realizing that the a4 pawn is a little bit overextended, he played the move of queen to c2, not allowing black to so easily play a move like rook e8, because then the then the pawn on a4 is going to come under some fire here. So in this position, black played the move queen to d7. It's a little bit hard to give black great advice, but I mean, queen e7 is probably as good a move as any here. Now, at this point, the computer gives a very interesting suggestion of playing g4 and weakening your own king, but basically saying you've got so much piece activity with queen g6 in it that it doesn't even matter. Like, in this position, you're just going to push the pawns forward, bring the knight in, and just really leave black completely passive. That being said, this is an approach that looks a lot riskier and I think is a lot less human. I think the move that Gukesh played of c4 is, you could say, has a very similar level of effectiveness, where the exchange of pawns is certainly helping us get at that black king a bit more. So black played the move d4 in the game, trying to keep things closed up. c5 just helps to isolate the black structure and split it up, as it were. The move queen f7 is probably, you could say, technically a mistake, but even playing d3 is still going to make it pretty tough for black to survive after queen to c4. Rook to e7 is a threat, and white can also try and pick up the pawn later, so it's still not great. But after queen f7, what happens now is that This pawn is just going to be way too vulnerable. And yeah, it turns out good even play to move queen d3 and go after the pawn this way. Black can't take on c5 because there is a rook e5 fork. This is the tactical point of ignoring the threat on c5. Of course, the way that Gukesh played, just repeating the moves is, not so bad either, let's say. Where, this time he decided to bring the other rook with rook 1 e4. Just very nice way to take away squares from the black pieces. Rook 88 was played. You could technically take that pawn safely, but Gukesh decided to go for rook f4 first. It ends up basically just being a transposition. And yeah, with best play, this position is going to be winning for white. But you might notice here that Gukesh was already quite short on time, still needing to play 5-6 moves in order to, technically 6 moves in order to make the time control. So yeah, in this position, like queen b4 is a really nice way to cover d2 and b2 at once, but the game's king h2 was also pretty good here, and after g6, queen b4, definitely deserving exclamation mark. Queen f7, at this point I think that, black's only real source of counterplay is sort of in the d pawn. So if you play a move like king g1, just getting out of any pins, this would, I think, be not such a bad move. Because if they play queen a2, like, you can always go back and just repeat the position in the worst case to just inch that bit closer to the time control as such. But in the game, white played rook to e1, which, I don't think we can really fault it. Rook f8, rook e4, just keeping the control. We don't really mind exchanging when we're up material here. Black plays rook d5, and it was with the next two moves that white kind of lost his grip over the position, where the best move for white actually is probably to play the move king to g1, which might look a little bit weird, but it just gets you out of the way of any queen to c7 check. It allows you to kind of move the knight later on without worrying about the pawn f2 being undefended. So it's kind of a good prophylactic move for white in a sense. Also, like, let's say if they play, a move like queen d7, it's quite easy, to play a move like knight d2 and just get to the time control safely with a big advantage, as it were. It's true knight e5 is technically better, but yeah, it's true also that white doesn't have a lot of time on the clock, let's say. So in the game, he played knight d2 directly, which is not the worst move by any means, but Abbasov found a very nice defensive knight g7, which is actually not just attacking the pawn on f2 here. Granted, it's not too late for white to admit his mistake with knight f3 and still keep a big advantage, but white played a move king g1, thinking this was more effective to just keep everything sort of blockaded. But the problem now is that after Abbasov's knight e6, that suddenly it's quite difficult to keep your extra pawn on c5 alive. Because if you play a move like rook c4, black can even just play like rook e5, and suddenly black has some very real counterplay with rook e1 against the white king, or rook e2 to attack f2, and suddenly it's white basically has to give back the pawn in some way to to sort of neutralize this attack, as it were. So realizing this, Gukesh, realizing things had kind of got out of hand here, he played the move rook e3 and accepted, okay, I just have to win the game all over again. And for the moment, black's position is fine, but he does have to be a little bit careful because of the slightly open position of his king. And at this point, black, I think the most sensible move for black is probably just go knight d7. Rook d3 does run into the knight e5 fork. But yeah, it just sort of allows you to just keep things pretty solid here. Also move like b5 as possible, or computer wants to go g5 and offer a trade of queens, but this does strike me as a little bit weakening for the king in a human point of view. But still, all these moves are better than Abbasov's knight e6, which does just give up the pawn, and it's not really clear what compensation black gets for it. So we have b5, queen c3, knight f4, threatening some forks, but the move rook e3 does cover it here. Black plays the move rook to g5, trying to create counterplay. And it was at this point, actually, that white missed a little bit of an opportunity where in the game he played this move of knight e4, which was maybe a little bit too clever in some respects. But it turns out that we actually can ignore the attack on the g2 pawn. Well, to be fair, we kind of have to ignore it because rook g3 is blundering to knight e2, of course. And, g3 is also running into knight h3 and the f2 pawn being on. So, we kind of have to accept, the g2 pawn's already a goner in a sense. But by playing the move queen takes c6, like very, very cold-blooded here, it turns out after rook g2 and king f1 that black actually doesn't really have a great way to line up the attack on f2, because if the knight moves away, white's just going to play queen g2 to defend against queen f2 mate. And if you play like rook h2 or something, well, there's no mate threat yet. Rook h1 is covered. And that buys white the time to play rook e8. And white's attack is just going to be faster, where we can play rook b8, threatening rook b7. And if they try to cut off the queen with knight d5, well, for one thing, rook h1 is no longer mate, so it gives us a time to play rook b7, stopping queen f2 mate with the absolute pin. And then in this case, like, white's just going to win a piece, knight e7. And, we can play like queen d6 and we win the knight and we win the game, essentially. So this is what white had to calculate in order to win, basically. Computer points out a couple of other moves, but yeah, queen 6 is just the obvious one. But the move knight e4, the problem with this is that after takes and king to h1, well, knight f6 is a decisive threat, but the problem is that black now plays the move of knight d5. And he covers the f6 square, so that if white plays like knight c queen 6, well, knight e3, and you can't even take the knight because it's mate after that. So in the game, white plays the move knight f6 first, a little intermezzo in order to be able to take the rook. But still, after knight d5, black does get back the exchange, and after take, we end up in this extremely interesting queen endgame, where white is currently up a pawn, but faces the issue that his king is quite open, giving black very good chance of a perpetual check. After queen f5, it's one of these positions where, like, if black plays correctly, it's just going to be a draw, but where there's no instant perpetual check. Like, the king can try to run over to the queen side and use these pawns as a shield, or to set up counter checks against the black king, as it were. So black is not completely out of the woods yet. He still has to find some good moves. And yeah, h5 was played in the game. Like, technically it's a fine move, but you could probably also make the point of playing queen d3 and trying to just trade off pawns as maybe an easier path to the draw in this case. But h5 was played, and this bought white a little bit of time to at least start to get the a-pawn rolling. And after, once again, I think queen d3 is probably a very good defense here, where I'm guessing that, Babasov had something he didn't really like here, that, maybe he was a little bit concerned about something like queen to e6 and or such. But yeah, in this case, like, a5 does run into queen d2, winning back the pawn, so it's not a big concern, let's say. After queen g5, this is how it played, where black just kept on giving checks, and as you might expect, Hukesh kept the game going. He played king to e2. Black's not threatening to take h3 because of the pawn on g6 being hanging. And maybe this is the reason why Basov played the move g5, but it does turn out that, technically speaking, this is a decisive mistake. And what black had to do is, it's a very tough position, actually, for black, but it turns out that actually the move king h8 is the best move. And the sort of subtle point of king h8 is that you basically are trying to avoid a situation where the white queen goes to c7 and white's able to push a5. Because the further that pawn advances, the closer it gets to queening and the more valuable it will become. Like, already we almost have a little bit of a race situation of sorts. But also, like, let's say if white does play queen to c3 and then, plays a move like a5, just try and get the pawns rolling. Well, now black can sort of take here, and, even though white is getting this a6 move in, black also can play queen g2, and, suddenly we're seeing that, sort of this lining up of the queen against the king against queen is a little bit of a problem here. Like, king d4, queen f6, and, white just doesn't really have a great way out of the checks in this instance, and yeah, it's basically going to be a draw, like king b5. Like, this might gradually get out of the checks, like queen c7, queen c5 stuff, but then black's able to take the pawn, and that's just enough for black to be able to survive by, again, giving check ad infinitum against the open white king. Something like this, for instance, and white just can't get out of the checks here at the end of the day. But yeah, that's admittedly a little bit of a tangent, but it does show like how black would draw such a position. Unfortunately, after g5, white found a or unfortunately for Abasov, white found the very nice move of e4, where after queen takes h3, queen to g6, white captured the pawn on g5 with a check. But even this position, actually, white still has to be quite precise in order to win. And the really difficult point that white needs to see to win this position is not the move a5, which, to be fair, black starts to play a lot of good moves to hold from here, but he has to find the move queen e5 check. And then, of course, king h7, queen f5 is something you want to avoid as black. But after king g8, white has this move of king to f2. A very subtle move, but the point is that you're just taking away a lot of checks from the black queen here. And a move like queen h4 will just run in a queen g3. So actually, it turns out that black has no checks. And it's sort of a common principle in queen endgames, actually, that you want to place your queen in the center, because that will also take away the most squares from the opposing queen. And also just buys us the time we need to go for a5, get that pawn moving, and basically win the game here as white after some further adventures. But in the game, Gukesh played a5, and to Abasov's credit, he actually defended very, very accurately over the next moves. Of course, we're in a race right now, so in a race, you better start running. We had queen h6, king g6, queen 6. Again, you want to make sure to avoid the trade of queens, because the pawn endings are just winning for white here. We had king h8, a6. And yeah, at this point, black has to be a little bit precise with the checks he goes for. Queen h3, king e2. We had a little bit of a shuffle before the king went to c4. Black side went for the move queen to c8 check, all pretty natural. You check the king and you're also making it harder for white to queen his past a pawn. This is the one that really matters, being the more advanced pawn in the position. So we had queen to d8, queen d6, still forcing black to play accurately. For example, something like queen a8, queen c6 would actually already make it very hard for black to save the game, where we can see that black would be starting to run out of checks here. So black plays queen a5 to have a bit more flexibility, and after king e6, again another tough decision where an automatic check like queen a7, queen a2 would actually already be losing after king e7, where there's no more checks, and white is even going to have some mating ideas against the black king to kind of seal the deal here. So Abasov plays move h3, very, very nice move to get that passed pawn rolling at a time when white is not able to play a7 so directly. White played a move king f7, black found again the only move of queen a2. Because queen h5, queen g6 is going to be the key, but after queen a2, white sort of admitted that, wherever his king goes, like black's going to be fine, like king f8, queen g8, king f6, queen f2 check, or king e7, that gives black the time to get his own pawn ready to queen. But after queen e6, we get this queen ending that, well, according to theory, is just a draw, but it turns out that actually after queen a7, black still has to be very precise here, where if you allow white to sort of give a check in the right way, like if you allow white to get the queen to f5 with tempo, then it's actually going to be a winning position for white due to the mating threats against the black king. But Abasov, to his credit, avoided this with the move king h6, the only move. But after queen to e3 check, again, black has only one move to survive, and we can already see here that the players are, at move 82 already, and it's time trouble as well, both sides just playing on the 30-second increment. And here Abasov blundered with the move king to h5. It turns out that the only move to survive is actually to play king h7. And, well, the checks don't really lead anywhere, like king h6, and, all you can really do is, either repeat or, if you do play like e5, black is just going to start giving a million checks to the white king. Queen is not in a position to block them effectively here. And, yeah, that was the way in which black had to play to hold the draw in this instance. You could analyze it deeper, but I think you get the idea. But in the game, after king h5, actually it turns out that white also missed a win here, where he played a move king f5, which ended up working in the game, but as it turns out, what white needed to play was actually to move queen c5, which again is related to the idea of getting the queen to the key f5 square with check. So let's look at the options. If black plays a move like king h4, for example, well, we see here that white is going to succeed in getting that queen to the key f5 square. And with the black king being sort of cut off here from the pawn, this is actually going to be a theoretical win for white, where white will be able to maneuver his way out of the checks. He will eventually, set up a good block or a good counter check to, be able to win, as it were. And if black plays a little bit differently at the start, if he plays a move like king to, let's say they play king h6, for example, well, then white's going to go queen to f8, and if black does try to keep the king around the king's side to try to deal with the threats, what's going to happen is that white's just going to play king f7, threatening a checkmate, and after queen g2, you're just going to line up the exchange of queens and just win it in this way as such. Likewise, if they play like some other move, like if they go king g7, it's going to be a very similar story, like king h7, the queens will get traded and white will win the pawn ending as such. In the game, after king f5, it turns out that black now had to find a move of queen g2, covering mate on both g5 and on h3. And by giving check with queen g6 and harassing the king, this would still allow black to draw the game. But after the move queen f1, white was able to play queen to f4, and black just runs out of good checks here, like queen f3, king f6. There's no more good checks for the queen, mate is threatened, and white is just going to win here, basically. And because the e-pawn also is too strong, along with the mating threats. And in the game, after queen b5, white played a very nice move of queen e5, which I think is what Abasov must have overlooked in his calculation. Because, if you go queen f1, white just goes king e6. He's going to trade the queens on the next move and win the pawn ending. And if queen d7 is in the game, king f6, king h4, queen g5, and given that king h3, queen f5 will force the queens off the board, this is why Abasov resigned. So this was a very interesting recap. Very interesting games as well. Like, we spent a whole hour, to go through all of the salties of it, because the game's just so interesting and had a lot of quite critical moments to go through. Also just a very critical round for the standings, as now we have Nepo and Gukesh equal in the lead on 3.5 out of 5, and Caruana being sort of the leader of the chasing pack on 3 out of 5, with everyone else being on 2.5 or less as such. So that's basically how this round went, and I think it's definitely whetted our appetite and got us really excited for the rest of the tournament. I think that this round was actually in a way just as interesting, if not more interesting, than round 2, even though round 2 did have 4 out of 4 decisive games. But anyway, let me know in the comments below, what was your favorite move or your favorite game from this round? I will see you for the round 6 recap tomorrow, and take care.